We embrace the diversity of our community and we acknowledge the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which we honour Australian Defence Force service and sacrifice. We pay our respects to their elders past and present. Since the dedication of the Shrine of Remembrance in 1934, servicemen and women, veterans, descendants of veterans and their friends have assembled in this place, this very special place, to reflect on the tragedy of war and the hard-fought campaigns involving Australian servicemen and women. Most importantly, we remember those veterans that are no longer with us. Good afternoon. My name is Lieutenant Commander Jan Gallagher. I am a Shrine Governor. And on behalf of the trustees, the governors and the wider Shrine family, I'd like to welcome you to the Shrine today, whether in person or via the online link, and thank you for participating in this service.
Thank you, Commander Gallagher. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 2nd 14 Battalion Association's annual Shrine Pilgrimage and Memorial Service. We are gathered here today in the Shrine Sanctuary to remember the 226 members of the 2nd 14 Battalion who laid down their lives defending our freedom. I would like to call upon our President, Jill Baer, to give the address.
After the recitation of the ode later this afternoon, you'll hear us say, "We will remember them," and lest we forget. Lest, what does that word mean? The dictionary says to avoid the risk of. So when we say lest we forget, we're saying we will remember them so that we avoid the risk of forgetting them. Twice a year, near Anzac Day and now in September, members of the 2nd 14th Battalion Association and our friends come together to the Shrine in order to remember and ensure that we don't forget the men of the battalion who fought in the defence of Australia during the Second World War between 1939 and 1945. These were our fathers, our uncles, our grandfathers, sometimes our brothers, and we want to make sure their sacrifice is not forgotten. Today, we remember especially those who gave their lives during that conflict in order that we could continue to live our lives in freedom. Today, we read and remember their names. Behind each name, there is a story. Some we know, others we don't. But there are two names today that tell us something about what we as a nation lost by the sacrifice of their lives. Jack Barnard and Harry Saunders. These two men had brothers who went on to make significant contributions to our country, and we can consider the potential that was never realised, that we lost to war when they died. Jack's brother, Lance Barnard, went on to be Deputy Prime Minister of Australia for several years in the early 1970s. Before he enlisted, Jack showed early promise as the president of the Youth Labour Movement in Tasmania. He could have been more than his brother. Harry's brother, Reg Saunders, and Gunditja Maraman from near Warrnambool was the first Indigenous person to be made an officer in the Australian Army. He attended the same training course as my father-in-law, Lindsay Bear, in 1944, and went from being a lieutenant commanding 30 men to being a captain over many more men, over 100. Later in life, he became one of the first liaison officers appointed to the office and later the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. He was awarded an MBE by Queen Elizabeth II in 1971, again we are left to wonder about what Harry could have contributed to this country. As we hear these names, let us commit to making sure the sacrifice of all these men is not forgotten. Thank you.
The President will now lead us in the Lord's Prayer, and this will be followed by the reading of the Roll of Honour by Reservoir High and Kingsbury Primary School students Tiana Waters and Ivy Olveshki, where we remember those members of the battalion who made the supreme sacrifice.
Please join me in reciting the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Thanks, Ivy and Tiana.
Palestine. Private Clarence Arnold Hutton. Private Walter Patterson. Western Desert. Private Charles William Faber. Syria. Private Stanley Ernest Percy Barry. Corporal Hugh Allen Buckler. Sergeant Oliver Romney Clerk Dossiter. Private David Donald Cree Eddington. Private William James Fletcher. Private James Watson Forrest. Private William Joseph Healy. Sergeant Raymond Henry Lawley. Lance Corporal Russell Davidson McConnell.
Private John Donald MacDonald. Private Alan Russell Middlecote. Private Walter Painter. Private William Patrick Riley. Private Lindsay Sanna. Private Noel William Smallman. Corporal Edgar Richard Staley. Corporal James William Uren. Private Kenneth Charles von Bieber. Private Christopher Moody Walker. Corporal Rupert Stewart White. Lieutenant Robert Kirkwood White.
Australia. Corporal Ernest Arthur Loy. Owen Stanley Mountains. Private Lawrence Leslie Allen. Private Joseph Attard. Private Robert McMorrin Barrett. Private Albert Bell. Lieutenant Thomas Harold Bissett. Lieutenant William George Boddington. Private Leonard Vincent Bow. Private Frederick John Bryant. Private Wilbur Lloyd Cahill. Private David Clifford Carland.
Private Bernard Francis Carlson. Private Alfred John Clare. Private Walter Allen Clark. Corporal Albert William Cook. Lance Corporal Llewellyn William Mark Cook. Lieutenant William Prescott Cox. Corporal James Alexander Craig. Corporal Leslie Walter Croton. Private Gordon Norman Crump. Arthur John Davis. Private John William Dawson. Corporal Leo Daniel Dealey.
Corporal Frank Allen Dolphin. Lance Corporal Thomas Francis Doolan. Private Leonard Edwards. Private William Robert Edwards. Private John James Egan. Corporal Stanley Clifford Ellery. Private Gordon Raymond Etty. Private Raymond Alfred Farnsworth. Private John Allen Ferguson. Private Thomas Joseph Fletcher. Private Clifford William Follett.
Acting Sergeant George Lynn Gibson. Private Peter Gill. Private Alfred Bertram Gosh. Private Walter Maurice Greenwood. Captain Thomas Hull, Private Robert Hamilton, Private William George Hancock, Private Edward Harris, Private Joseph Harvey, Corporal Albert Thomas Hayes, Private James William Hayward, Private Robert Horwood, Lance Corporal Reginald, also known as Stanley Robert Hunter.
Private Roy Victor Hunter, Private Arthur Eric Jackson, Sergeant Sidney Douglas Johnson, Private Alec Maley Jones, Lance Corporal Frank Lionel Jones, Acting Corporal Robert Lindsay Kelton, Private Lloyd George Kerford, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Samuel Key, Corporal Mark Kilburn, Private Albert Henry King, Private Keith King,
Private Bruce Steele Kingsbury, Private Jack Knipe, Private Joseph Swanston Nuckley, Lance Corporal Ivan George Leask, Lance Corporal Edward Alexander Lowe, Private James Alexander MacDonald, Private Alexander McPherson,
Sergeant John Morris Matthews, Private Ambrose Main, Acting Corporal Charles Reginald McCallum, Private Sidney James McClure, Private Charles Maxwell McGivelry, Corporal Ron Allen McIntosh, Private Christopher McKinley, Corporal John Arthur Metzen, Private Albert John Joseph John Misson, Private Charles George Muffet, Private Pietro Giuseppe Moltoni, Lieutenant George Greenwell Moore, Private John Patrick Moore, Private Raymond Walter Morris, Private Graham Munro, Private John Alexander Nelson, Private Morris Blair Nisbet,
Warrant Officer Class 2 Wilfred Alexander Noble, Private Francis John Noonan, Captain Claude Charles Purvis Nye, Private Stanley James Oppie, Private John Patrick O'Sullivan, Private Thomas Charles Parrish, Private Herbert Frederick Paxford, Private Edward Albert Randall, Private William Vincent Ratchford, Private Claude Herbert Roberts, Private Henry Leonard Salter, Private James Patrick Scullion,
Private Norman Wallace Smethurst, Private David Harry Smith, Private Donald William Smith, Private George James Smith, Private John Snelger, Private Alfred James Souter, Private George Leslie Speechley, Private George Thomas Spokes, Private Nelson Leonard Spooner, Private Max Gordon Stead, Lance Corporal Alexander James Taylor, Private Bevan Laurie Morton Thomas,
Private Clarence Robert Tice, Private Lawrence Rex Veal, Private Eric Groves Vile, Corporal Lewis Leslie Waller, Sergeant Herbert Philip Warman, Private Alan Henry George Warren, Private Robert Watts, Private John Anthony Wellens, Private John Norman Wilkinson, Private Dennis George Thomas Wills, Private Douglas Galbraith Wilson,
Gona, Private Stanley Philip Anderson, Private Robert Baird, Corporal Philip Burns, Lieutenant Jack Gurney Clements, Private Ronald William Clifton, Private Colin James Cockayne, Lance Corporal Vernon Charles Davis, Private William Dawson, Lieutenant Robert Henry Doherty, Private Arthur Edward Dunford, Sergeant Cuthbert Douglas Dunlop,
Private Braidwood Clifford Evans, Private Clifford Albert Freestone, Private Alan Arthur Fife, Private William Henry Gaskell, Acting Corporal Reginald Galdart, Private James Percival Gosh, Private Rupert Arthur Hanbury, Private Alan Vincent Charles Herlock, Private Donald Charles Impey, Acting Sergeant Charles Cameron Ivan, Private William James Kerr, Acting Lieutenant Gordon Lewis Cole,
Acting Warrant Officer John Alexander Lockett, Acting Corporal James Keith Lockyer, Acting Lieutenant Hector Ewan Cross, Ross MacDonald, Private Ronald Joseph Mayberry, Private Bruce Allen MacDonald, Acting Captain Alan Stewart Denzel McGavin, Private John Francis Mills, Private Albert John Nielsen, Private Gordon Edward Noakes, Private Eric Ronald Norwood, Private Patrick O'Connor, Private Anthony Joseph O'Dwyer, Private Leo James Edward O'Kane.
Lieutenant George Edward Pearce, Acting Corporal Ronald Chesson Russell, Private Harry Saunders, Acting Sarge Ivan Ralph Stevenson, Private Ronald Albert Taylor, Lance Corporal Vivian Raymond George Thomas, Private George Frederick Thompson, Acting Captain Austin Morris Tracy, Acting Sergeant James Halbert Truscott, Private George Alfred Udall, Private Morris Valley, Private Norman William Walwick, Private Richard Edgar Walters, Acting Sergeant Ronald Mackeson Woolhouse,
Markham Ramu Valley, Private Ernest Charles Back, Private Noel Ollie Bailey, Private Claude Ernest Baker, Corporal Jack Barnard, Private John Henry Cobble, Private Clement Dowling, Private Francis Gerald Finnegan, Private George Henry Hubner, Lance Corporal Ian Garnett Langton, Acting Warrant Officer Francis Frederick McLennan, Private William John O'Day, Private William Arthur Patterson, Private Aubrey Allen Pottinger, Private George William Tyndall,
Balikpapan, Private Norman Allen, Private William George Anderson, Private Robert Bear, Sergeant James Alexander Boll, Private Ronald Brown, Lieutenant Horace Leslie Kavanagh, Corporal George Kenneth Clark, Lieutenant Francis Collins Dole, Private Leo Hubber, Lance Corporal Graham James Hunter, Private Francis Thomas Jacobs, Lieutenant Robert Knox Knight,
Private Ernest William Masters, Private Kenneth Bernard Mills, Private Rupert Stanley Nichol, Private John Ian O'Neill, Staff Sergeant Stanley Walter Simmons, Private Ronald George Edward Talbot, Private Robert James Trotter, Private Ralph Stanley Usher, Private Henry Adam Waits.
Lives lost after transfer to other units. Private Edward A. Argle, Sergeant Raymond T. Bruin, Private Edward Dolner, Lance Corporal William K. English, Private William Green, Private Norman F. Harlan, Private Arthur H. Hartwig, Private James W. Hopkins,
Private Reginald H. Howard, Sergeant Thomas A. L. McLennan, Lieutenant Albert L. Sargent, Private Philip G. Scott, Private Murray Smith, Captain Philip A. Tuckey, Private John S. Wade, Corporal Francis E. Warren.
Thank you, Tiana and Ivy. We also remember those who served and have passed on since the end of the Second World War. Shrine Guard, take post. The President and students from Kingsbury Primary School will now lay the wreaths. We will then recite the ode, and this will be followed by a minute's silence where we will pause to remember those whom we have lost. For those who are able, please stand for the ode and then remain standing for the national anthem.
They went with song to the battle. They were young, straight of limb, true of eyes, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end against odds uncounted. They fell with their faces to the foe. They shall grow not old as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the evening, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
Thank you.
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are one and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil. Our home is girt by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty, rich and rare. In history's page, let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
Shrine Guard, stand down. For those who would like to offer a poppy to remember the fallen, we invite you to do so in the urn now. Well, that concludes today's service. On behalf of the 2nd 14 Battalion Association, I would like to thank the Governors and the staff of the Shrine of Remembrance for their generous support and assistance. And I'd like to thank each of you for attending today's service in memory of those brave souls we've lost. Thank you.